and good afternoon. My name is Michaela Denny, and I serve as Education and Training Director for the Voices for Florida Open Doors Outreach Network. We thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is one of our monthly webinars in which we'll be really focusing on our Perspective series. The topic this week is legal services for sex trafficking survivors. I'll serve as your moderator. And as we get going, I'd like to take time to introduce our panelists. The first person that we would like to introduce is Brent Woody. Brent Woody is the Executive Director and Lead Attorney for the Justice Restoration Center. Upon learning that legal services would be an urgent critical need in survivors' restorative journeys, Brent started the Justice Restoration Center, a nonprofit dedicated to providing pro bono trauma-informed legal services and anti-trafficking advocacy on behalf of victims and survivors. Brent has played critical roles in survivor-centered legislation, including Florida's human trafficking victim expungement law, and he and his wife, Pamela, with Advocates Against Human Trafficking, arrange safe prison releases, coordinating safe transportation and restoring housing for previously trafficked inmates. Hannah Sweeney was the primary researcher and author for the Legal Deserts Report, which was released in July of 2021. The report centers on legal access for survivors of domestic sex trafficking within the United States. It showcases ways in which access remains inaccessible in practice for many survivors. The report was produced by and in collaboration with the Avery Center and the National Survivors Law Collection. Hannah served at the Avery Center as an AmeriCorps VISTA member. Hannah has a bachelor's in political science from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in human rights from the London School of Economics, and is currently a JD candidate at Harvard Law School. She's passionate about utilizing the law to protect human rights in practice. Next, we have Jamie Rosseland. Jamie is a consultant in the field of anti-trafficking work with expertise in the program development and implementation for victims and survivors of sexual exploitation, trauma-competent and survivor-centered digital marketing and outreach strategies, and most recently working on policy guides and research projects. She's been active in local government and statewide level policy advocacy. Through sharing her lived experience and unique perspective, Jamie is committed to change the cultural view of the sex trade, address systems that drive demand, and confront gender inequity. Jamie was one of the first hires for the Open Doors Outreach Network as a survivor mentor back in 2017, and is experienced providing mentorship, court advocacy, and care coordination to youth impacted by sexual exploitation. She now consults with us on our educational and training programs. Thank you, Jamie. And Jamie has presented at countless community events, statewide summits, and national conferences. Currently, Jamie serves on the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice State Advisory Work Group. She is a social science scholar at the Florida State University, where she's working on earning her undergraduate degree in interdisciplinary social sciences. And in 2018, Jamie won the Survivor Advocate of the Year Award presented by the Florida Attorney General for her outstanding work with exploited youth. In 2021, the United Nations published the Delta 8.7 Justice Policy Guide, which Jamie contributed to as a working group member. And additionally, Jamie was recently guest appeared on the New York Times podcast, The Argument, addressing the intersection of anti-trafficking work and pro-sex work technologies. Finally, we have Ashton Dumdei. Ashton is a licensed clinical social worker and has served as a clinician in the Open Doors Outreach Network since 2008, providing trauma-informed and survivor-centered therapy to youth and young adults impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. As part of the Open Doors model, Ashton works alongside survivor mentors and regional advocates to provide advocacy and care coordination to survivors navigating various intersections of the legal, education, and child welfare systems. Ashton also co-facilitates trainings for community providers and stakeholders to expand access to trauma-competent services across the systems that engage with survivors. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Alabama and a master's in social work from Florida State University. Ashton is passionate about incorporating community-centered healing practices and elevating survivors' lived experience to shift cultural narratives around commercial sexual exploitation. So we're about to open the questions, and the thing that I'd really like to kind of talk about is we're talking about the legal services for survivors. Let's start with Brent. Brent, you have a long history of advocating for survivors. What legal services do survivors need?
Well, I'm not sure we can list all of them here, but I'll kind of just provide a general list. One of the most obvious things are criminal arrest records, and I know we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we move forward. But state and federal criminal arrest records, coerced debt or debt bondage, and some of the things that the obligations or so-called obligations that come out of debt bondage. Certainly, family law issues related to child custody or marital issues if survivors married to a trafficker and various things like that. You might have outstanding warrants that need to be resolved either through expungement or through negotiation with the state. We have intellectual property rights, which is not something that intuitively might pop into somebody's mind, but as our survivor community continues to teach and write and do various things like that to have intellectual property rights attached to them, protecting those rights is important. Immigration certainly comes up. You might have federal tax matters, which is something that we see from time to time where a survivor has been trafficked in a brothel or in a Nevada brothel, as a matter of fact, where they're 1099 and then they have a tax bill, and restitution and civil claims that they may have against hotels or third-party facilitators in various situations like that. So those are the things that kind of come to mind. There's a lot of other things, I don't want to call them odds and ends because it kind of sounds trivial, but just things that come up that are just not completely predictable, but they come up.
Right, and it sounds from what you're saying that there's a combination of civil and criminal issues that come up that would need a lot of specialization from an individual like yourself. Would you say that's true?
Well, it needs specialization from individuals other than me because I
right.
those areas, but it does highlight, because of the range of issues that come up, and some of the, there's a whole specialization within human trafficking. So this is not the walk-in, call from the phone book. Do they have phone books anymore? But anyway, call and make an appointment to come in and talk about a routine legal matter. So there's a specialization there, and then of course within these practice areas, tremendous need for attorneys to step into these spaces and use their skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you have been doing this for a number of years, and with other colleagues like Hannah. Ashton, you work with survivors. Many of them are juveniles. Can you tell us about your perspective on the legal services and how you engage the criminal justice system when advocating for your clients?
Absolutely. Yes. So as you mentioned, in the Open Doors team, we work with ages from 10 to 24. So a lot of the survivors that I work with are minors, which means we often have the intersection of the juvenile justice system, as well as the foster care system, the child welfare system. So we really see a lot of need for advocacy and also partnership with those systems and those organizations. So we are really active in staffings when there's hearings, court advocacy, being present. And we've built some relationships with, juvenile probation officers, attorneys, judges, where we've kind of seen some of those policies be able to shift. One example I can give is that there are judges now who, when they know someone is a CSEX, so commercial sexual exploitation survivor or victim, they will make the courtroom private instead of having it where anybody can be in there and hear what's going on, right? So a lot of that, I think, comes down to partnerships within the community, education, and really having a understanding of what trauma looks like and how that plays out and how those systems might interact.
Yeah, and I'd like to say a special shout out to the Delores Farr Weaver Policy Center, for which you are working with it. They really focus on juvenile justice, criminal reform, and particularly on work with girls as well. So, Ashton, we know that Florida has some excellent laws regarding trafficking, including the Safe Harbor Act, which prevents minors from being arrested for prostitution. However, many trafficked victims are still involved in the juvenile justice system. What special needs do you see in your work for this population? Like when parents can't attend court, juvenile records aren't immediately sealed, things like that.
Right. So yeah, we do. We have some great laws. I think the intention of those laws is to make sure that minors are seen as dependent and in need of services instead of criminalized. However, in practice, there's still a ways to go as far as criminalization still happening to these youth. So they can't be arrested for prostitution. However, they can be arrested for, substance charges, right? Or even like absconding, referred to as missing, but a lot of times it's referred to like running away, missing school. Once you're in the juvenile justice system, for whatever reason, a lot of times these issues start coming up where we have kids in crisis who are then not meeting those probation requirements of being in school or coming home by curfew. So they kind of get pushed further and further into the justice system, despite being victims and being survivors. So we see a lot of needs for, like I said, kind of coming alongside those systems and providing advocacy to make sure that those survivors have therapeutic environments and healing environments, and aren't getting pushed into more of the commitment program, criminalized side of the justice system. So yes, and then of course there's also the intersection of the child welfare system, foster care. So a lot of times you mentioned parent support systems, right? These adolescents are navigating multiple systems at once, and we have a pretty good, at least here in Northeast Florida, we have a pretty good crossover program that addresses needs, and they really actually bring the youth into those decisions. They'll have staffings where they have the youth identify what their needs are. So we have made, I would say, even since I came on in 2018, some significant progress through partnerships and through education. However, we do still have a ways to go in terms of really having stakeholders see these survivors as survivors and not as criminals.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of the conversations that we've had on previous webinars, we're talking specifically about the approaches to serving survivors is sort of pushing them into facilities, into convictions and things like that for their own good, et cetera, and because they can't find a reasonable alternative for that child. And so that child is once again re-victimized. And so I think that's a really interesting point that you're talking about, like, we, in theory, what we have, and then how that's being applied is really important. So obviously there's a great need in the survivor community to access both formal and informal legal services. So Hannah, you and your group of researchers investigated accessible legal services that are in the country. Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, of course, it's a great segue, especially mentioning the idea that ideally the services are more publicized, and the laws, safe harbor laws across the country are changing, that there is a recognition that maybe we should not be prosecuting people for being victims of trafficking. So what we wanted to do was approach it from a sociological perspective and say, okay, let's acknowledge that there are survivors who do have prior charges or other legal needs. What are the odds of them actually being able to get connected with a legal provider, and then even further have positive outcomes to allow them to move forward? So what we did was reach out to 550 organizations across the nation that self-advertised as providing legal services for survivors of trafficking. And the team of researchers reached out to each organization and attempted communication on at least 3 occasions, either through phone calls, emails, etc., to try to clarify what sort of services were offered. And as Brent had kind of mentioned before, there's a huge array of what sort of legal services might be needed for survivors. And certainly different providers are limited in what they could provide. So for example, someone who specializes on immigration law can help with T visas and other things, but may not be able to help with vacatures or certainly child custody, and vice versa for lots of issues. So we were trying to chart out where do services exist, and what areas are really lacking. And one of the biggest findings that came of that was firstly just a massive lack of response. So we had roughly 20% of these organizations come back to us, and that's from a team of researchers that know what we're looking for, are also reaching out on behalf of a partner organization working with survivors, and attempting on multiple occasions. And the truth is, a lot of survivors aren't going to have that same level of self-advocacy to continue to reach out or to know who to reach out to begin with. So that is a major problem in the industry. And outside of that, from folks who did reply and tell us about their services, we see a massive both geographical gap between rural and urban areas, as to be predicted, but also in the types of services. The nature of the law, for better or for worse, is so geographically limited in where attorneys can practice. So if you have someone who was previously trafficked in Nevada but now lives in Minnesota, the likelihood of them finding someone in Minnesota, which they might reach out to, that could help them with a vacature in Nevada, is incredibly unlikely. And if you have multiple priors in multiple states, you would need to find legal services in all of those different states, or find someone who was able to practice in multiple areas to assist. So these are not things that are new. Certainly survivors and grassroots community organizations have spoken to these problems for a long time. And what we tried to do with this research study was really to just put that into data and finalize and legitimize things that survivors have been articulating for a long time in terms of pragmatic obstacles to actually accessing these resources, even if the laws are changing.
So one of the things that I'm kind of curious about with the work that you're doing is, it seems like if you went out and just did a kind of a search for legal services for survivors, that you would probably come up with quite a few names that advertise that they do provide those services. But if you're looking further into, for example, what particular services are being provided, how often, et cetera, do you find that there's a big difference in that? I mean, it sounds like kind of what you had found. I mean, you said you reached out to 550. Is that a common thing that you're hearing?
Yes, absolutely. So one, you could advertise as providing legal services, and that might mean that you're able to provide someone a know your rights session, or maybe a court companion, and all of those things certainly have value. But of course, if you're looking specifically for legal representation, that's very different than looking for someone who maybe could, accompany you to a court hearing for a custody case or something. So part of that is the gap between what you're looking for. And for us, like, we were specifically trying to figure out which organizations allow legal representation and for what sort of cases. But that's already presuming a lot of knowledge on behalf of the survivor to be able to articulate what sort of legal aid they need, and whether or not it's in a criminal capacity, or if they even know vacatures are possible. So really just trying to highlight the gap between what seems like is available and what actually is. And I also want to highlight a lot of the services we found, with the exception that we'll talk about in a little bit of some of these areas of hope and trends that we are seeing with more human trafficking specific legal providers. What we see a lot of is folks who advertise legal services but are only able to work with immigrant populations, or only work with domestic violence victims. So of course, those things are incredibly important and needed. And there is a lot of overlap between the trafficking community and domestic violence and immigration. A lot of those teams may not necessarily be trained specifically in trafficking, or they could help specifically with T visas or orders of protection, but not with vacatures or other needs for trafficking. So you may, even if you are connected to a legal provider, have to be working with multiple attorneys from different organizations to help with your immigration proceedings separately from other things. So just the level of self-advocacy that is required of the survivor in the system.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I'm really thinking about that, reflecting on, talking about working with multiple attorneys, different organizations, understanding the differences in civil, criminal, and all the different complications. So I appreciate that. One thing I want to say is if you have questions that you'd like to submit for the group, we do have the Q&A chat, and we are looking at that. I see a few have come up. We'll get to those in just a moment. Jamie, I kind of want to bring us back to talking about the intersection of the criminal justice system and sex trafficking. What are some of the other barriers for survivors accessing legal services?
Yeah, I mean, I just even want to take a second to like pause and like reflect on what Hannah was saying a little bit.
Sure.
I had the privilege to be a part of the Legal Deserts Project to some small extent, and I remember the researchers, the students, almost having like emotional responses from reaching out and reaching out and reaching out to all these different providers and just not getting like anyone responding, and how that was like taking a toll on students who haven't been, I mean, I don't want to say haven't been traumatized, I don't know their histories, but like presumably haven't, been trafficked and been through all this stuff, and it's not so deeply personal to them. But for me, it was really impactful to see them having emotional responses, because as a survivor myself, I have been in that position where I have felt so frustrated of like, oh, people say that there's help, people say that there's things for me, but like whenever I try to access them, like it's so hard. And so knowing that that's like a common experience just for a person, without adding layers of like trauma and things feeling like super personal. So just even that emotional impact of what it's like to reach out for services and find out like they're not a good fit, and especially when you don't have the language to talk about it, and you have this history of trauma, and it's like personally impactful. And so as far as like barriers go, I think there's you can kind of categorize survivors in two types of ways, like survivors who are like connected to services, and survivors who have never heard of services ever before, and may not even necessarily identify as survivors. And so I think the biggest barrier for that like latter group is what Hannah's talking about with the Legal Desert reports. They don't have someone else helping them navigate those systems, help them with like language. They're having to go out and do this on their own. And I think one of the biggest barriers may even be just identifying as a trafficking survivor, and even thinking that you can get these types of services, or even knowing about those types of services. For the subset of people who are already involved like with services to some extent, I think there's some less than ideal practices that happen in the movement as far as like gatekeeping when it comes to legal services. And so just from my own personal experience, I know I found out through a service provider I could get my record expunged. It wasn't even something I really knew I could do. And this was like 2 years out. And that service provider like got me connected. Well, actually didn't get me connected. Like I was like taken in a room and like talked to a lawyer on the phone who I never had their phone number, or I didn't know how to contact themselves. I didn't know I was allowed to contact them myself. There was misinformation given about how like I had to work with law enforcement in order to get my record expunged, which I had to be like a verified or confirmed victim. And when all of that like didn't work out for me, I just thought, well, that's it. Like it's hopeless. This is something that I like can't move forward for. And then luckily it was actually Brent was a lawyer, had my information and called me and said, hey, do you want to do this? I'm like, oh, I don't want to work with law enforcement. I don't want to do all of this. And he's like, well, that's fine. Like, how do you want to do this? And we're going to do it that way. So I think that story kind of like embodies like, for once, like gatekeeping of like service providers taking that like decision-making power and trying to decide when they think people are ready and able to proceed with legal services, service providers almost even having an agenda on, getting like kudo points with law enforcement for, getting people to work with them for convictions, and then as well as like misinformation being spread within the movement. So those are some of the barriers I see for like survivors who are connected with services. And then even like having formal legal services, like someone, like Brent, who's like helping you specifically with a case, is really important. But then I also think work in the informal, arena is also really important. I know I actually worked alongside of Ashton at the Delores Board Weaver Policy Center for some time, and that was like one of the biggest things is a lot of times, just whether it was an adult or a child, if you showed up to court with someone who had a badge with their picture on it, oh man, like it made all the difference. Like it wasn't even like having to have like a lawyer show up necessarily in some of these like criminal justice proceedings, but just having someone with like a badge that says this person is good, be nice to them, like can really change outcomes.
There's a question that came in the Q&A that I think really kind of goes along with this, and it says, is there a consistent set of benefits that all trafficking victims are provided with in Florida, and are services provided only through facilities and NGOs, which would be non-governmental organizations? Anybody want to go for that?
I can say there's victims of crime funding, which I think is a great resource. It provides a pretty limited amount of funds to help with like therapy and other costs that may come up. But I would say like the limitation of VOCA funding is you have to be cooperating with law enforcement in an active case to be able to receive that funding. But as far as I know, there's nothing that's standardized. Britt might have some more information about standardization of legal services in Florida, but as far as I know, obviously you get a public defender if you can't afford an attorney. So that's like a standardized thing in America.
Right. I mean, there are, for example, in Florida, there are, victims' rights, like when you're talking about sexual violence, domestic violence, they get a list of like a pamphlet that has all of their rights listed there, et cetera, which would apply, of course, in these kinds of situations as well. I think it's really important that you bring up that point, Jamie. And one of the criticisms of the VOCA that we get all the time is that, there is a lot of VOCA funding available. And we often, because part of Open Doors is funded through VOCA, and it's a really important source. As far as the legal services, we have very, very low numbers of people that select to access. And again, because there's some pretty significant barriers there. And also, we obviously refer to folks like Brent and Hannah and other individuals who do provide these legal services, but they're often doing that without the compensation from like a state fund, et cetera. And I think that's important to note. And then, okay, so let's see. Brent, let's just kind of pull this back. How time sensitive are these issues? Like, what's important for service providers to know about connecting survivors to legal services?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just want to say what a privilege it is to be on a panel with Jamie. It's just, she was just obviously one of our clients, and became a friend and a colleague and an advisor to us as to how to try to do what we do better. And I find myself texting her during one of her presentations saying, "I didn't realize that, I didn't." So I always learn something. So this is, I just wanted to thank you, Jamie, for including me on this panel. And I do want to also mention, one of the gaps, one of the issues that we found really early on with Florida's expungement law, which is incredible law, and it's even better now after this last session. We fixed a couple of things and hopefully fix a couple more next session. But we were finding that the misinformation that was being communicated out of clerks' offices, even state attorneys' offices who didn't realize that we had this new law. So we'd be contacted by somebody who says, well, I was told I could only expunge one case and I couldn't expunge it if there was a conviction, and all things that were incorrect. And, we were very frustrated because we felt like a survivor could contact that, what should be not legal advice, but at least reliable information, and that they could close the door on the possibility of expunging their record for the rest of their life, because they may not circle back and try to figure out, I mean, why would they say, gee, I wonder if that's wrong. So, that's been a long journey of trying to make sure people understand, people who should know, understand, there's that remedy that may be available to a survivor. And so that's like even worse than they just don't have the information, is they get the wrong information and then proceed, based on that wrong information. The time pieces to this, I think, are super critical in a couple of respects. One is just as a pure legal matter, you have statutes of limitations that, if you hang around for a couple of years and don't check into something, you may lose your rights to pursue an action, against a hotel or, that sort of thing. And there may be deadlines for filing certain motions and the like related to a case. So there's sort of the practical legal side of making sure you don't delay. And then, of course, there's the restorative side, or that's kind of how I refer to it, which particularly when you're talking about criminal record expungement in Florida, well, anywhere for that matter, that's such a fundamental piece of that restorative journey, and it doesn't happen overnight. So, I think, I agree with Jamie 100%. The gatekeeping or waiting until they're ready, and I realize there are mental health aspects to that whole that whole thing, but I think.
Your dog disagrees.
We kind of thought that might happen, but we weren't sure. For dogs, in case anybody wanted to know, but
No worries.
Yeah. So, and of course, it's possible I just lost my train of thought, but I think, I think those sort of artificial, keeping this benefit, or whatever you want to call it, under wraps until at some point in time is potentially really harmful, in part because I think that's probably a harmful practice to begin with, but also because withholding that possibility of record expungement, which might only get completed about the time they may be graduating from a program, I think it's really dangerous. And so I think that should happen early on, in a legal assessment of all the potential legal needs. And the other thing that can do, again, from a restorative perspective, is begin to establish a relationship between the survivor and an attorney or a team of attorneys who, if they're doing it the right way, will be trauma informed, and that will be a constructive part, again, of their journey. And I think, along with all the other, people that are involved in that process, I think that's a really healthy way to begin to sort of introduce a healthy part of their interaction with the system. I think the timepieces are really, really important.
Well, Brent, actually, and a question that came up as well is they said, this is an anonymous attendee, what training is available for attorneys with these cases? They said that they'd encountered some frustrating situations with attorneys defending their clients, but not having good knowledge about survivor needs and rights. So again, it's, the services that are available, and then the specialization, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's a great need within our industry of being trauma informed. So there's for me, there's the trauma informed piece, but there's also the knowledge of human trafficking and the knowledge of the law and the knowledge of the nuances of the law. And that's not something that comes overnight. I mean, you can understand or you can know our human trafficking criminal statute, but have no idea what these factual scenarios really look like, that are going on every day. So, I think those two pieces of training are probably the most critical, which are available. I mean, we have trauma-informed, the National Survivor Law Collective, we're doing trauma-informed presentations. So that there are resources and ways to do that, ways to get connected. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that, the rest of you correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think every attorney ought to be trying to do this. I believe that some just, with all due respect, maybe don't have the temperament or something that to really be in a constructive, empowering, encouraging kind of relationship that I think is a critical piece to this. And but yeah, training's available. My email, we can set them up.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we'll include some resources and links at the end, and then as well as in your follow-up. I'm going to go back to Ashton. Ashton, I know that the survivors that you work with often have encounters with law enforcement. When they have to provide testimony, what kind of support do they need?
So survivors that we work with, a lot of times, one, it's even getting to the point where there is enough evidence to get to a point where testimony is even an option. Like a lot of times, at least with the survivors that we're working with, kind of like I mentioned previously, we're kind of working on the other end to make sure that they're not getting criminalized and they're not getting charges put on them. But a lot of times there's not enough evidence or not enough, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is right now. Like we don't even get to that point a lot of the time in our work with survivors. When that is something that a survivor is going through, if they do end up working with law enforcement, if there is an active case and there's, they're seeking prosecution of a trafficker, I think that there's kind of going back to that time piece, there's a lot of support that's needed because inherently survivors are recalling details that are going to be very re-traumatizing, very triggering, having to kind of that process in order to give testimony. And I've also seen a lot, which kind of our legal system in general is these, it's being dragged out longer and longer and longer, right? Like it's being passed. And every time that happens, then the survivor is not able to really get to a space of closure because then they're having to kind of follow this legal system wherever it's going. I think as far as like emotional support, kind of as Jamie was mentioning, it really, I've seen a huge difference when there's any type of agency and choice provided. So a lot of times when survivors do get victim advocates or when they allow someone like me, someone like a survivor mentor to be able to be in the room during interviews or even outside of the room to be able to provide, that type of emotional support during interviews. That has made a huge difference because it's allowing that survivor to at least know that there's people who are there specifically for them and for their best interest. And everyone has different roles, right? Prosecutors' roles is to get a conviction, and that's important as well. But a lot of times I think there's still ways to go in recognizing how that impacts the survivor and what emotional supports they may need during that process. So I think, that would be my answer is having advocates, having people that are specifically there to support them and their emotional needs during that time is really important. And I've seen that kind of mitigate some of the, the harm that can be caused by going through a process that can be so re-traumatizing and re-victimizing.
And one thing I will say with the Policy Center and the Open Doors Outreach Network, it's really kind of a unique aspect is that we provide our services are ongoing. So there's not a begin or the end. So you might have a survivor who needs a lot of different kinds of intervention services, mentorship, who may or may not ever end up with like a legal resolution or interaction with or interaction with law enforcement, or it may be years in the making. And programs that are not designed to just to have be a, a 10 session or a, step program, but really are designed to work with the survivors and kind of the tendency for survivors to come and go out of the system is really important. Hannah and Jamie, so what is the impact for survivors when they receive the legal services, and what value does that have for them?
I can start with just some of the basics of having prior convictions, depending on the nature and extent, can serve as boundaries from being able to access everything from new jobs to affordable housing, custody in some cases, as well as limits on financial aid if you're trying to apply and go back to school, as well as prevent you from being able to access social welfare benefits and food stamps. So, the extent of the benefit of legal services, if it is such that you're able to expunge these records or have vacatures for priors, I mean, it really is the difference of being able to actually restart and rebuild your life, or being stuck with the consequences of things that maybe you were coerced in some form to do. I'm sure Jamie can give maybe a more personal or subjective perspective.
You're on mute.
I can't get through one Zoom call without doing that. So
None of us can, so don't worry. It's okay.
right. Brent's dogs barked, so I'm doing better than that. I don't have any dogs. In all seriousness though, I think, there are those like really like objective concrete things that like having an expungement means. Obviously I like went through the process and successfully had mine expunged, and I'm here talking about it publicly, and there's news stories and but it's a sense of justice is a hard word. I don't know if I'll ever feel like I have justice for like what happened, but like the injustice of being like criminalized for what happened to me, like that, there's all these like pragmatic things that are really important about that process, but there's also this like really deeply impersonal experience of feeling like, oh, that's been righted. That was something that that community did to me, that society did to me, that the criminal justice did to me, and they've now recanted that. They've now said, we were wrong in this, and your charges are clear. And that's that provides like emotional and psychological benefits. I think that even surmount the pragmatic ones. We talk a lot about how expungement helps with these like really pragmatic things. I think for me, it really helped feel closer to a sense of justice about what happened. And then there's all these like little things that are like super important. So my mom was super sick and was hospitalized up north for a little while. And I had to go into like the hospital to get like an extended visitor's pass. Otherwise I had to go through security every time I showed up at the hospital, which was like every day. And I wouldn't have been able to get that little badge and like go see my like sick mom, like if I still had those charges. And so there's these other like smaller pragmatic things, but like just being able to get into hospital to like see my mom and not have to go, I can just like drive through the gate and like show them a little pass instead of like having to be searched every time I go in, was like a huge deal. Not having to worry about like school events, for my like kid. Like there's all these like really small details that I think a lot of people take for granted in their life, and expungement really alleviates a lot of suffering, a lot of unspoken suffering, I believe. And then, I think there is, when you get a lawyer like Brent, when you get a lawyer who's trauma informed and who believes in choice and agency and following and being survivor centered and following the survivor's lead on what they want in their lives, then I think you have these opportunities to create these other restorative relationships where I have people who are like for me, who like see me as an individual, who like value what I want, who like value me saying like, oh no, I like talked to law enforcement one time, I'm never doing that again. That was like super hard, or, you know, but for people, you know, human trafficking, like trauma is the experience of having like power taken away. And so I think in any type of services, including legal services, when you can extend like renewed agency and like renewed choice to someone and allow them to be in charge of you know, to an extent that it makes sense, like of how things go, it can be really impactful. And so yeah, just even the relationships I built with Brent and even some of the attorneys in state attorney's office where my record was expunged, like those connections are really meaningful in my life as well. It wouldn't have happened without that process.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, for being willing to share, especially that personal side of what you're talking about. And, you know, I really appreciate that perspective, and thanks to everyone for that. Brent, can you tell us a little bit more about Florida's expungement law in particular? Obviously, Jamie has been one of the beneficiaries, or at least participants, I should say, in that process. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure.
I'm a beneficiary for sure.
Is beneficiary okay? I don't know. I feel like that means it sounds like it was like you deserve what happened to you, and I don't like that. So,
oh, I benefited greatly from the expungement law.
Benefited greatly. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. If I could just comment, you know, real quick, when we Jamie was talking about a sense of justice, and I don't really think of it in terms of someone receives justice, because in some respects it's too late for that in you know, total, but we do talk about that sense of justice. And when we filed the very first expungement petition in Florida in 2014, you know, we got it worked, and we were like, this actually worked. I mean, we didn't know what would happen. We expunged the record in that sense of justice was, you know, I'd like to, you know, say that we thought about that ahead of time, but we really didn't. And when that order came back and we forwarded it to our client, the impact was so incredible. And so from then on, it kind of almost reframed why we did this. Even in cases, in situations where we could only expunge maybe half of their record, because they may have, you know, 50 cases and only 25 of them were really related to their trafficking. I mean, probably all of them were essentially related to their trafficking, but we could only expunge a certain number. But you know, it was still worthwhile for that reason. So it's I think an understated importance of being able to expunge and criminal records. So Florida, I mean, I have to brag a little bit about Florida's law, because it just is among the best. And in my opinion, it may be actually the best. I am certainly biased, but I think we're almost up to 900 charges that we've expunged in the last, you know, since 2014, or starting in 2014. So it is working. It does work, and it's expansive enough that you know, we can expunge a human trafficking charge if someone's a victim offender in a situation or so-called bottom situation. You know, we can expunge that charge, and there's only a limited number of charges that can't be expunged. And currently, even if there was an arrest for a robbery, we can't, in the state never even charged, we still can't expunge that arrest record. But we're fixing to change that in our next legislative session, I hope, so that we can expunge those charges as well, which actually then would give us a route to expunging those more serious, I don't want to say more serious, but usually they're more related to more violent situations, be able to expunge those. So yeah, it's remarkable what it has allowed us to do. Is to really forge some relationships with state attorneys' offices and specific assistant state attorneys that work in primarily sex crimes, who usually review our petitions to expunge. And so we're able to, really have collaborative relationships, which does a lot of things. It usually streamlines the process a little bit. It also kind of, for those assistant state attorneys that maybe don't see all the pieces to a human trafficking case, maybe it draws them into these stories a little bit. And some of our real heroes in the state are these assistant state attorneys who, they know when they get a petition to expunge, they understand that this is the intent here is to right a wrong, and that's really incredible. So I'm needless to say a big fan.
Well, I should mention that the citizens of Florida should be a big fan of you as well for your personal involvement in drafting a lot of that legislation. So we definitely want to recognize you for that, and others who have really contributed to that. Ashton, when you work with survivors specifically, how has having a criminal record impacted their lives?
So significantly, I think it presents pretty huge barriers for even things like basic needs, like housing, employment, childcare, custody, right? Custody of dependents or children,
Yep.
Which we see obviously a lot in the adult population, but even the minors that I work with, a lot of times maybe there's crisis and they need emergency like respite care or an emergency shelter. And a lot of those shelters and programs have certain charges, right? That they're not allowed to accept people who have those charges. So a lot of times, even, the more obvious, I think, component of like advancing, careers and that restorative piece of it, absolutely. But even like basic needs, a lot of times it impacts them being able to get access to any kind of safety or stability. And I think there's also, even I've had instances where even when adjudication is withheld or even when the charge is dropped, those arrest records are still showing up. And even if it's something, prostitution is a misdemeanor, but it carries a huge stigma. And it, if that pops up on somebody's background check, a lot of times that's going to stop them from different employment opportunities or housing opportunities. So we see that a lot, even if they weren't convicted of a crime.
Yeah, and I want to add to this, and thinking about this, like the work that we've done, particularly with Jamie. I mean, there are barriers for survivors who want to be involved in the work and to serve as either survivor mentors or clinicians, et cetera, and that they have to go through that, criminal background check as well. And so they may have something on their record that actually prevents them from being able to even work in the field. And one of the things that we try to emphasize with Voices for Florida and the Open Doors Outreach Network and all of our partners is the importance of having survivors in the lead, having them at the table, et cetera. And so this is an important barrier that we have to talk about. Jamie, you're currently researching the impact of the criminal justice system has on survivors. So how long does that process take for survivors? Because I know you've been through quite a long process.
Yeah. So for me personally, my expungement, I think, was around 4 years from the time I first contacted or was in contact with Brent to the time that I actually got like the paperwork from the state attorney's office. And then even there's a process then it has to come out of the clearinghouses for the people for law enforcement departments who hold whatever that is for background check. So it can be quite a long process. I know that's not like that for everyone, just from like pulling on my little research numbers right now. I'm currently working on a research project. There'll be a link when email goes out if you're a survivor and you want to participate in this research. You want to contribute to it. I have like another week of data collection, so that would be great. I pulled up I know where it is. So just from like some of the research I'm seeing, out of respondents, only 9 out of 35 people had no criminal justice system involvement at all. So of the survivors who've taken the survey, obviously, like criminal justice system involvement is a huge part of it. And then as far as like how long it takes, from people who like responded, a few people has taken them 1 year, a few more people is 2 years, another person is 3 years, another person is 4 years, and for a few more people it's 5 years. So this is, I've also often been like a panelist with law enforcement on the panel as well. And one of the things I talk out a lot about criminalizing survivors, like period. I think we should stop criminalizing people for selling sex, period. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts. I don't think we should be relying solely on victim testimony for convicting traffickers. I think there's lots of other ways to convict traffickers, like through financial crimes, and all sorts of other things. So all of that to say is the criminal justice system takes its tolls on survivors pragmatically, and then in these really like interpersonal and deep ways as well. And it's not as simple as getting your record expunged. It's, unless you have a uber collaborative team who's like done expungements before and is like ready to get this out, and is willing to do it within a few days, a few months, like that's great, but most likely expungement is going to take years, and then you have to deal with that. And then how long did it take you before you even found a lawyer who would do this for you? Like, and so I just think we have to stop criminalizing survivors. There's a quote I pulled up that I would like to read, because I often also hear the argument that like people need to be arrested, that like victims need to be arrested, because like if you don't arrest them, then they're not going to figure out that trafficking's bad, and that so the quote is from Judith Herman, and it says, "No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her immediate best interest." And so if jail seems to be an effective intervention for people in trafficking situations, that only speaks to how horrific their situations are when they're not in jail, and how far we have to go as a movement to get better services and better alternatives in place, other than the criminal justice system. So
I love that you brought up that, Judith Herman quote. I actually literally, as we're doing the work right now, I have my copy always ready and available for me. This is the Trauma and Recovery. That's a pretty good tome. I wanted to ask Hannah a little bit. So I wanted to share a quote from the Legal Deserts report, and it said, "Trafficking survivors have more protections than ever before. In practice, survivors are often unable to access the legal assistance that would allow them to realize their rights. Human rights that exist only in theory are nothing more than mirages in a desolate desert." And while Florida has a great expungement law and dedicated attorneys committed to assisting survivors, there's still far too many people in Florida and across the nation able to access these services. So what are some hopeful trends you're seeing that can shift this narrative?
Yeah, well, I will start on a similar note as Brent by saying I do think Florida in a lot of ways has been a lighthouse for other states in terms of what the options are and how to proceed. Some helpful trends we've seen, even the creation and adoption of laws, particularly in Florida, such as safe harbor laws, or trying to address first and foremost, from my perspective, to stop arresting people. And to prevent, instead of focusing only on how can we mitigate against these expenditures or get vacatures, if we could just stop arresting people, that's the core problem. And we're quite far away from that point, to be frank. But there are a lot of other ways that I think we've seen growth of new organizations trying to address the gap currently existing. So even in the last 10 to 15 years across the country, we've seen a lot more human trafficking specific legal service providers open up. And that's definitely including the Justice Restoration Center, organizations like Free to Thrive in California, Alight Waste in Denver, are different mechanisms for connecting specifically survivors to attorneys that have been trained on the nature of providing trauma-informed resources. We've also seen an increase of law schools opening clinics. Both Villanova and Pepperdine have specific aspects for human trafficking survivors. All of this is very new. I noticed another question in the chat that had mentioned that, does human trafficking law fall under criminal law? In a lot of ways, it's emerging and developing field, and we've seen legal academics as well trying to craft almost a new field in terms of the different interdisciplinary ways that this impacts this particular population. I guess I would also mention we've seen something that I think is quite positive as well, is a lot of private law firms opening pro bono units to allow their private attorneys to work on pro bono cases with sex trafficking, like Paul Hastings, and I know more in Van Allen has one as well. Those, so long as they have access to properly train those attorneys and have access to how to engage in a trauma-informed way and basic information to how trafficking works, I think can be a really financially sustainable way to access legal aid on a larger scale, since a lot of those firms typically work in multiple jurisdictions or have attorneys based in broader spaces, that the network of what they can do sometimes is quite larger. And then lastly, I would say the work that everyone here is doing, Ashton included, of having advocates that can fill in the gaps when legal resources and legal representation in a lot of cases, when it's not accessible, what are the other options? How can direct service providers and nonprofits still provide some level of support or advocacy in between? There's a lot that can be done, but I do think there's a lot that we can be hopeful for as well.
I'm glad to hear that hope coming from you, Hannah, because I know you've obviously been doing this research all across the country. So if we're moving towards this shift to being more responsible to the practical needs of survivors, I want all panelists to answer, if there was one thing you could change, remember this is your dream scenario, about how the system currently works, what would it be and why? And I will start with Brent.
Just one?
Just one. We demand only one.
Wow, that's going to be really, really tough. Can I just comment again on before I answer that? I'm sorry. But first of all, expungements are going faster these days than they were in your time, Jamie. They do take time, and a lot of the time's taken in the front end of gathering information, and because there's a whole trauma piece of that just gathering that information we need. But our state attorneys and offices of statewide prosecution are working to do these things faster. So we generally don't have those super extended periods of time. Obviously, in some cases we do. So that's a good development. And I just wanted to say along the lines of the quote that we talk about that we can expunge the record, but we can't expunge the trauma. So that really kind of leads me to, I think that one thing would be that you've all touched on is not criminalizing trafficking victims, and the all of what that can save when that's when that's how it happens. And I think, along with that is our trauma-informed law enforcement. Those were, because there's going to be touch points more than likely with the criminal justice system at some point, whether it's a trafficker being arrested or the interaction with investigators and all that kind of thing. And I think that a trauma-informed, victim-centered approaches along those lines are just really critical. But yes, we don't need to be making these arrests, particularly in these so-called human trafficking, or I just call them prostitution stings, that Jamie, I've talked about. And there is an option, and that can happen. That doesn't need a huge policy change. That's really just a matter of making a decision on the law enforcement and on the law enforcement level. So that would be mine.
Okay. Let's go to Ashton.
Well, Brent stole mine, so I don't have too much else to add. I'm sure several of us probably have the same kind of idea, but yeah, I don't know if it counts as one change, but the biggest change dream scenario would be having a system that doesn't criminalize survivors, and potentially a system that is demand focused and holds, purchasers of sex and traffickers accountable versus criminalizing the people who are experiencing that.
Okay. And Hannah.
Yes, I think I alluded to that in my last answer as well. My answer would be the same, to stop criminalizing victims of trafficking.
And Jamie?
Yeah, I feel like I already got on the soapbox. That's definitely the biggest change. If I had to add anything to it, like better social safety nets for people. And so it's like stop criminalizing, and then also like let's create better social safety nets so this doesn't happen in the first place. Or if it does happen, people don't have to be so incredibly resilient to get out. Like if we could just like lower the bar to exiting, that would be great. So like,
right,
not criminalizing survivors does that, but I think also incorporating like more robust social safety nets for people.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what I'm hearing from a lot of folks is, obviously the starting from the perspective of believing survivors about what has happened with them, and then kind of breaking down some of those barriers to entry, which is typically an economic term. But if we're talking about services and access, et cetera, we have to deal with not just physical barriers, but also as sort of like emotional and legal barriers that keep people from even coming forward and being able to talk about those things. So with that, there are a few questions that came up here that I think I'd like to kind of ping pong back between you all. Let's see. Sorry, let me get to let's see. This one I thought, Jamie in particular, is there a statewide or nationwide mentor program for survivors to seek ongoing support?
I'm glad that question came up. It's a really great question. There are so many at this point, like different networks of like survivor leadership type groups. Rebecca Bender, Elevate Academy is one, the National Survivor Network. They're not on social media anymore, but there is a way to get connected with them. The Survivor Leader Institutes by like Jims and Rachel Lloyd. I saw Mrs. Phelps was on here, Runaway Girl. They're ending the game curriculum. If you're a survivor on this call or watching this at a later time and you want to get connected to other groups of survivors, like my email is going to be sent out. Please email me. I will get you connected. Even more than expungement, the most life-changing thing that happened to me after I exited, and I sometimes tear up when I talk about this, is getting connected with other survivors. And just having that like sense of like, yeah, me too. Like, and I don't have to like explain myself. Some of my closest, bestest friends today are survivors, and yeah, just on a personal level, on a professional level, on an academic level, having other survivors around me has given me the ability to go further than I ever would have been able to go on my own. So
Thank you so much. So yeah, and then those will be followed up. There's another question here that I think is interesting, and I think perhaps maybe if will be best for Hannah. Let's see what you think, Hannah, and we can pass it along if you think it's not the right one. Is anyone tracking the effects or outcomes of these laws in order to provide a quantitative measure of the effectiveness of the current laws?
Yes, I was
That
hoping
might be a Brent question too. Go ahead.
No, I'm keen to hear Brent's perspective as well. I was going to plug, though, specifically on this note, I can drop it in the chat as well. Polaris does state report cards in partnership with a few other organizations grading the criminal record relief laws for survivors of human trafficking. And you can go through the link and click on state by state to read what grade they've gotten and what the impact of how impactful that's been. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the person in the chat is looking for, but I would say that's a good direction of where to start if you're interested in what difference these laws are making. I'm not sure if you have something further to say, Brent.
Well, it's I'm not sure about quantitative measures, because how do you measure that? I was only turned down for 2 jobs instead of 5, or something like that. So I think it's really hard to, well, at least with respect to criminal record relief. So I think maybe someday we'll be able to do that, but I think it's largely qualitative at this point and anecdotal, I suppose. We can look at our clients and just look at the differences to the extent that we know what has happened. And in many cases we do. Jobs that they've been able to get, or being able to volunteer at their kids' school, or be able to bypass our background screening exemption, so-called exemption process for DCF or DJJ, and being able to kind of jump, get out of that exemption process and just be cleared to take a job. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure there's data. Maybe smarter people than me will be able to collect that at some point and quantify it. But to be sure, I think the advancement in all of our human trafficking laws, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to know what's the best thing to do. What's the if we pass this law, what are the consequences that we didn't really understand? That's why we try to get as much counsel and leadership from survivors as we can, because we don't know. There's so many things we don't know, and but I think we've made advancements. Again, that's my opinion. That's not quantitative. Well, it's one person's opinion, but I really do. I think our advancements have made a huge difference. And I did want to just say something about criminalization, because there's something about not criminalizing. It's not just that survivors may come out without a criminal record, but that really implies a whole shift in perspective on the part of the criminal justice system. That just isn't, well, okay, we just won't criminalize. Well, there's a reason why we won't criminalize. And I think that, to me, that's as important as that outcome may be. I think that systemic change also has a lot of critical implications as well.
I would say, go ahead, please. Sorry. Jamie, go.
Yeah, I do want to mention the Delta 8.7 Justice Policy Guide. There is some data, not necessarily on the impact, like the positive impact on how these laws have made a difference, but there is some like empirical data on how criminalization has had negative impacts. I also do know at the Avery Center, and Dr. Angie Henderson has said this informally in her interviews with over 70 survivors of sex trafficking. What she was able to pull from some of that data was people who had criminal records, who hadn't been expunged, were their social economic status was higher than that of those people who had criminal records. And part of the research study that I'm working on now is also looking at how do people fare between if they were criminalized during the process and have criminal records versus people who weren't. There is, like, research is, heading in that direction. And I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, I think I wanted to say, if you think from Voices for Florida and, kind of my position is really looking at some of the empirical evidence that, peer-reviewed reports and then trying to make a case for best practice or promising practices. We've done a lot of research nationally, and while there seems to be a dearth um, of like, peer-reviewed articles, things like that, there are some really incredible organizations out there taking that on. I think the University of South Florida is one of them. They just recently launched a whole lab. And I know that there are many others, probably other people screaming up and down, we're doing that too. But I think that that is forthcoming. And it's also really important for how it is that we make the argument for the services that we need. And at the same time, one of the things that I often get feedback for the Open Doors Outreach Network is, we want to see some of your outcomes and your outputs in terms of the impact on survivors. And what we value the most is the survivors, empowering survivor to make their own choices and to not re-exploit them for any of their stories, et cetera. And so finding a balance in that it can be really, really hard. And that's why we're, kind of working with people like Jamie and others to really understand that a little bit better. There's one more question on here that I thought we might have time to talk about. And it's a little bit less related to some of what we've just talked about. It says, so are there currently enough shelters or programs providing specialized support for trafficking victims, including legal services? And then it says, how many more are needed? So everyone's smiling. I would like to just start out and say that there are certainly not enough spaces when we're talking about housing, especially we're talking about emergency versus transitional versus long-term, and places that are not, that are encouraging people for independent living versus like a programmatic treatment kind of program, or specialized safe harbor housing placements and things like that. We know that there is a severe shortage of that. And so there certainly are not enough. And then would anybody else kind of like to jump in on that question? What about legal services? Brent, I know you're out there doing this. Are you overwhelmed with requests? Do you invite other colleagues to join you?
I'm mildly encouraged, whatever that means exactly. I don't know, but I am encouraged. It used to be, we did feel like we were the only ones in the whole state, and in some respects in most of the country. And that may well have not been true, but based on what we could know. But I think, the National Survivor Law Collective, which has great members, Hannah mentioned some of them. So it's sort of a national group of service provider or legal service providers that are sort of similar in character. And I think we're seeing more attorneys step into the pro bono space to help. And I think, what it comes down to is we talk a lot about education and awareness, but I think it's the more we can help people change what they care about, they become more passionate about stepping into doing what they can to help. So it's not pro bono, like I've got the weekend and I can fill out some paperwork, and not to disparage attorneys that do pro bono work on the weekends, but they can step into it in a way that's it's going to mean more to them than just fulfilling an obligation. So I'm encouraged that there are people learning more, caring more about it, and stepping into that space more.
Great. Hannah, did you have anything to add to that from your perspective?
No, I think that was a great answer in the context of Florida. I think on a national level, we certainly see a gap of services providers that, more information can be found if folks want to reference the Legal Deserts report. I know we already linked, but I think we've hit that note hard today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Jamie, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us all with? I'm going to give you the honor of that, if you'd like to. She's like, don't put me on the spot like that.
as I'm like reflecting on the conversations that we've had, and I just feel like, and just even on this panel, like there's like such great relationships. I would say like that's what I'm encouraged by as well, is the sense of like collaboration, you know, among just us as individuals who have developed, you know, relationships over years, but just even in the movement. I'm encouraged by the number of participants who were interested in this topic, and the people who are viewing it live, and the people who will, you know, view it at a later time as well. I guess my hope is that we just continue in this direction of like growth and moving forward, and yeah, listening to survivors and being guided by their voices and their experiences and their expertise as we navigate the current legal system and have our hopes and dreams for what the legal system could look like 10 years from now. So.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Voices for Florida and our panelists, I'd like to say thank you for joining us this afternoon. We wish you a productive week. If you have any further questions, you can follow up with the team at Voices for Florida, or contact myself, and I'm Michaela Denny, or any of the panelists. And we'll be sending out evaluation forms and certificates shortly, and that'll include our contact information. Thanks for all the great questions. Have a great day. We look forward to the next perspectives.